Carbon is the biggest disruptor of the 21st century, and the world as we know it is changing. Eco-engineers can guide you to make the best decisions as you navigate toward your clean energy goals. Our diverse team of carbon analysts, engineers, scientists, auditors, and regulatory specialists are trusted advisors of the clean energy fuel sectors worldwide. Clean energy regulations are a maze. We simplify them with an unbiased approach and fully manage your compliance. Modeling your carbon reduction is complicated. We quantify your emissions with a rigor based in science. Together, we can create markets that will protect and grow your investment. We create sustainable solutions for a better tomorrow. We are Eco-Engineers.
Hello, and welcome to the second part of our two-part webinar series on the latest information regarding the EPA set rule. The EPA set rule is a proposed set of changes to the current Renewable Fuel Standard that the EPA released at the end of last year. It's currently under review and expected to be fully approved this coming June, and the changes are anticipated to become in effect in 2024, January 1st. In the first part of our series, we presented an overview of the set rule, defined what is happening in electric vehicles and eRINs, and discussed the roles of the major parties in the value chain to generate RINs using electricity. If you weren't able to join us for that webinar, I encourage you to visit our website to access the recording. In today's session, we want to provide a little deeper detail on the set rule, talk about the new proposed D-code separation, and how some of the reporting and registration changes will affect the generation of RINs. I'm Dan Chacha, EV Services Director at Eco-Engineers. To help us understand these changes, we have a great lineup of our regulatory experts. Kylie Bednarik is our RFS carbon consultant with expertise on compliance, and she'll be talking about the specific RNG and electric changes in the registration and compliance rules. Sean Gasson is our RNG team lead and will detail the important changes with RNG and separation that will make producers' life a lot easier if the rule's adopted as is. And Chelsea Anderson is our expert on the RIN, LCFS credit, and other market drivers. She is also one of the authors of our newly released RFS and LCFS market forecast report. With this, Kylie, can you get us started and tell us about the key changes regarding compliance and registration under the set rule?
Yes, well, thanks, Dan. I'll go ahead and get into that. All right, so first, I'm going to go over the set rule's key changes to biogas and RNG pathway structure. And then I'll move into a high-level discussion on registration and compliance for RNG and eRINs pathways. So a quick overview of how it all works under the current program. RINs are generated for a volume of RNG, and then these RINs are separated once a corresponding volume of dispensed CNG is matched to that pipeline injected RNG. Any party can generate and separate RINs, and documents that establish contractual relationship and chain of custody for RNG are required to be uploaded at registration. So now taking a look at some of these key changes, under the proposed regulations, RNG producers are going to be the ones responsible for generating RINs once they inject RNG into the pipeline. And then RIN separation can only be done by whoever can demonstrate end use as a transportation fuel, which would likely be CNG dispensers. All parties will need to register with the EPA, and there will no longer be any need to upload these contracts showing chain of custody for RNG. The set rule also allows for RNG to be used as a biointermediate to produce other renewable fuels, such as electricity. And different RIN codes would be assigned to the RNG based on status to help with tracking and prevent double counting. So why the change in regulations? The EPA is really looking to lower their burden at registration time by not needing these contracts to be uploaded that show the chain of custody for RNG. These changes also help in preventing double counting of RINs where RNG has multiple end uses as either a transportation fuel or as a biointermediate. So next, I'll briefly talk about some of the key points for RNG pathway registration and compliance before moving on to eRINs. As mentioned in the previous slide, under the set rule, the biogas producer, RNG producer, and RNG RIN separator will need to register with the EPA. The biogas and RNG producers will have to have their third-party engineering review completed at registration time. And as far as compliance goes, all registered parties are going to have quarterly reporting requirements, and the RNG RIN separators will have to identify the reason that they're separating the RNG RINs, either for transportation fuel use or as a biointermediate to produce another fuel. And everyone is going to need to maintain copies of registration documents in addition to any relevant records and reports. So it's important to point out here that the set rule has more registered parties involved in the RNG pathway than there are now. And this means that there's going to be a larger overall registration and compliance burden. Because of this, everyone should prioritize understanding their registration and ongoing compliance responsibilities for their respective role in the pathway. Okay, so now I'll go through a high-level look at the proposed eRINs pathway registration and compliance pieces. Under the proposal, the EV manufacturers, or the OEMs, will both generate and separate RINs, and they will obtain the ability to generate RINs through RIN generation agreements set up with renewable electricity producers. Like for RNG, the three major players in the eRINs pathway will need to be registered, and that would be the biogas producers, renewable electricity producers, and OEMs. Biogas and renewable electricity producers will have to have a third-party engineering review completed, and OEMs will need to provide data on fleet size and characteristics at registration. As far as compliance goes, each party will be responsible for submitting quarterly reports in addition to maintaining records. OEMs will update their EV fleet information each quarter, and renewable electricity producers are responsible for retiring any RNG RINs before using the RNG as a biointermediate to generate electricity. As a final note, there are going to be many registered parties involved in both the eRIN and RNG pathways, and everyone is going to be subject to specific registration and compliance requirements according to their role in the pathway. The components highlighted here today are not an exhaustive list of everyone's responsibilities, and all registered parties need to prioritize understanding their respective registration, reporting, and record-keeping responsibilities once the final ruling is released and the program is implemented.
Thank you, Kylie. That's really important information for producers to understand. Great summary. Sean, the EPA's proposed changes in terms of how to handle mixed feedstocks, and that's going to be important to producers as well. Can you get us into some more details on that?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So one of the major changes, as you mentioned, is the US EPA's inclusion of a methodology for co-digestion of D3 and D5 feedstocks. As a refresher, D3 feedstocks are municipal biosolids, agricultural waste such as dairy and swine manure, and separated municipal solid waste. And D5 feedstocks are non-cellulosic feedstocks like food waste, fats, oils, and greases, and other kind of municipal waste. So under the EPA's current rule, they do not allow for co-digestion of D3 and D5 feedstocks, as they say it's hard to track how much gas the D3 feedstock produces and how much gas the D5 feedstock produces. So under the current methodology, if you co-digest D3 and D5 feedstocks, you will only generate D5 RINs. In the proposed set rule, the US EPA is including a methodology to allow co-digestion that will allow digester facilities to generate D3 and D5 RINs. So what is the methodology that the US EPA is considering? So they have proposed two options for facilities looking to co-digest D3 and D5 feedstocks. The first is a user-defined option where the facility will have to digest solely the cellulosic feedstock at a set range of operating conditions and measure those specific operating conditions, which include temperature, pressure, residence time, and several other process variables. With this experiment, the digester facility can measure the gas produced from that feedstock and determine a cellulosic converted fraction, which will apply once the facility is co-digesting both the cellulosic and non-cellulosic feedstocks. The second option is using a predetermined value that the US EPA has set based on published biomethane potential for 4 specific feedstocks. Those 4 feedstocks are swine manure, cow manure, chicken manure, and municipal biosolids. A facility looking to use this can select the predetermined value for that converted fraction if they are processing that waste, and use that to determine how much gas is produced from the cellulosic feedstock. So what are some of the major considerations for this? One of the major questions a facility will need to ask themselves before moving into the co-digestion space is your facility set up to receive and process new organic waste? Do you have the necessary pre-treatment in order to receive and handle the waste? And then next, is your facility sized appropriately? Do you have the necessary digester space to handle the new incoming waste? Is your gas treatment system sized enough to handle the increased gas production from the new waste? There are a couple of other considerations or risks. The incoming organic waste may add inconsistencies to the feedstock for the digester, which can negatively impact digester health and gas production. And for the 2 methodologies that the US EPA has proposed, the user-defined option requires significant data and testing, which may be overly burdensome for some facilities. But for the preset option, the US EPA has used very conservative values, which may be overly conservative in some cases, and facilities may be better off going with the user-defined option.
Those are all very welcome developments, Sean. Great update. Chelsea, with all of these structural changes that are occurring in the RFS, surely the market for these RINs are going to be affected as the supply is likely to increase. Could you kind of detail what the EPA is doing with respect to the renewable volume obligations and the general market?
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, I can do that. One major change right now going on in the RFS is the proposed RVO schedule. So the table here that you're seeing, 2022, those were the proposed RVOs. And for the first time, the US EPA is proposing a multi-year RVO. Now, what does this mean? This means that instead of releasing a singular year's RVO, the renewable volume obligation, they're proposing the 2023, 2024, and 2025 volumes. What this will do within the market is provide some stability, indicating to renewable fuel producers that they intend to continue to grow the RFS program and the volumes continue to grow. So if you take a look at the cellulosic fuels, which are going to be the D-code D3 and D7, you can see that throughout from 2022 through 2025, the volumes are growing. One big reason for this is the expectation of eRINs to take place. The EPA has stated that the eRINs will become eligible in 2024 and 2025. So you can see why it almost doubles in 2024 from the proposed RVO in 2023. The table below is what the proposed cellulosic RINs for eRINs will be. And we'll talk a little bit about that on a later slide with how they've come up with those volumes. But one thing just to point out is these are proposed volumes. These aren't finalized. So we'll have to wait until June when we're expected to get the finalization of the rule to see how the RVOs shake out. It's unlikely that they'll probably stay the same. There will probably be some changes, but we'll just have to wait and see in June what those changes are. Now, let's talk about the eRIN volumes specifically and how they came up with the eRIN volumes that they expect to see. The EPA stated that there's 3 potential volumes that could be used to help them decide how many eRINs are coming to the market. One is the quantity of renewable electricity used as a transportation fuel, and this is going to be coming from the OEM. So the OEM is going to somehow quantify what the renewable electricity volume is needed for the specific vehicles. Number 2 is the supply of qualifying renewable electricity. So this is just basically, is there going to be enough supply in the market to hold and to help all of these vehicles? And then the last one is the rate at which companies can complete engineering reviews. This meaning with the registration and the RFS program, a site visit has to take place and they have to do a detailed engineering report. And so that is one potential caveat on stopping the growth of the eRIN volumes. And so what the EPA has decided to do is set the volume of eRINs to the lesser of the 3. And what the EPA has stated that for 2024 and 2025, the lesser of these is going to be the engineering reviews. It's going to be the limiting factor in deciding how many eRINs are going to be generated. Again, this is what the US EPA has proposed, and this is what they think. So the table here to the right shows the math that they've come up with on how many RINs will be generated with the amount of engineering reviews. One other major change is the reporting for the quarterly eRINs. In the past, the RINs were done on a monthly basis, but the EPA is proposing to change that to quarterly. Now, why quarterly? Quarterly reports will allow for sufficient time for the renewable electricity generators to prepare information. One thing that has been said that is if they can give a longer amount of time to do the reporting, they're going to have more accurate and precise information to use for future growth with setting RVOs. Also, they've stated that it will provide less burdens on the OEMs and the renewable electricity producers and generators. So that is another reason why they're trying to shift to quarterly. But there are some potential issues for the quarterly reporting. Currently, right now, with the monthly data, you have a better idea of the amount of RINs that are being generated in the market. What this will do, shifting to quarterly, is there's going to be a lack of current knowledge on how many eRINs have been produced. Instead of 12 months of trying to figure out where you're at with how many RINs are being generated, you're now only going to have 4 months or 4 instances where you'll be able to see. The current CNG and LNG market is monthly, as I stated, and this is going to be new territory moving to a quarterly. It really hasn't been done with this type of market before, so there's going to be some initial changes and some different circumstances, uncharted territory. So one thing to know is the EPA has proposed to the OEMs that they must generate RINs no more than 30 days after the end of the quarter. They put this time limit on the OEMs to help ensure that the RINs are generated in a timely manner for the obligated parties. This is really important because the fourth quarter is where annual compliance needs to be demonstrated by March 31st. So you don't leave much time if they didn't have that 30-day time limit. Overall, there needs to be enough time for generation, the transaction, and the retirement of RINs, and it just could be an issue with the quarterly reporting and a 30-day time limit at the end of the year.
That's great. Thank you, Kylie, Sean, and Chelsea for these updates, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We're excited about these EPA set rule proposed changes and the opportunities that it's going to provide us in the alternative fuels industry. As a reminder, both parts of this webinar are being recorded and will be available to watch on demand from our website, ecoengineers.us. And as a final word, I'd like to make you aware that we have released our latest market report this month, which focuses on the forecast for both the RIN market under the Renewable Fuel Standard and the credit market under California's LCFS program. These are important reports that can help investors project revenue potential, project developers, producers, and everyone better understand the economics of their projects. At this time, we're happy to invite you to enter some questions into the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can in the last few minutes. Thank you, and have a great day.
Just want to say thanks to the panel and congratulations to Kylie for completing her first Eco Engineers webinar, first of many, I'm sure. And so I'll kick the first question over to you, Kylie. There's a question that came in about the registration process, and currently under RNG rules in the EPA process, one party essentially registers the pathway, and it could be any of those parties. But under the proposed set rule, how will that? I know we kind of talked about it, but can you just clarify? Is there one party or multiple parties that'll be registering?
Okay, yeah, for sure. Sorry, my mute was on. So the set rule would require multiple parties to register instead of just one, like it does for RNG, the RNG pathway now. So the biogas producer, our renewable electricity producer, and the OEM will all need to register, and then they would all associate with one another as part of their registrations for the eRIN pathway. And it's the same setup for RNG pathways, where the biogas producer, RNG producer, and CNG dispensers will all need to register and associate with one another.
Awesome, thanks, Kylie. And Sean, I know you've done research on this, and just want to talk a little bit about the potential for two things, I guess. The value of eRINs once they're generated, being D3 or D5 based on feedstocks, how that'll kind of work with the existing or new pathways. And then the second question is one that came in today. Do you think that there's any potential for woody biomass to start to enter into the EPA pathway process for like woody biomass to electricity generation?
Yeah, those are good questions. So the two approved electricity pathways are the ones approved for renewable natural gas as well. So if your biogas comes from a landfill, wastewater treatment plant, or agricultural digester processing like dairy or swine manure, if you use that biogas to produce electricity, that would generate D3 RINs. If you're using food waste in a digester to produce biogas or other non-cellulosic material, that will generate D5 RINs for electricity. For the question on woody biomass, that's kind of left up to the EPA to implement, probably in a future ruling. Woody biomass is technically an approved feedstock under the RFS as a whole, but there's not a specific individual pathway for woody biomass to electricity at this point. So that would have to be done through probably a pathway petition through the EPA.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, it's something that has been much talked about, but the set rule did not really address any changes to that woody biomass definition that's pretty strict today. And Dan, there's a lot of math that we presented in both of the slide decks and the previous one last week. Can you talk a little bit about just understanding the $54 per MMBTU that was quoted versus what an RNG producer might expect to receive if they're generating RNG versus eRINs, and why there's a difference all along the revenue pathways there?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Good question. We got a lot of questions around that slide. So the analysis we provided was actually performed by the EPA, estimates on the revenue and cash flow for eRIN pathways. And the way it was calculated was based on 7,200 miles a year of driving with a battery electric vehicle, and what that would convert to in electricity needed to charge that, and how much biogas would be needed to produce that much electricity for that electric vehicle. The assumptions made there were a $3 RIN price. So assuming that a D3 gets back to $3, it would present a revenue of $838 per electric vehicle that's on the road annually. Now, further, they made an assumption that that revenue would be split between those three entities that need to report into the program. That's the biogas producer, the electricity producer that takes the biogas and creates the electricity, and then the OEM selling the vehicles. They just did a simple 1/3 split to each of those entities. And that's not at all to suggest that that's how the split would actually be negotiated between those entities. But for simplicity of the math, that's how that was presented, and we carried that through as well. So the point was kind of raised a couple of times that $54 per MMBTU of biogas in that calculation is higher or different than biogas directly into the RFS. And that is true, and there's a number of factors around that figure, what the split is on the different entities reporting is a factor in that, so that would not necessarily be a third. Also, the efficiencies of an electric vehicle and of a natural gas vehicle are different, so that's part of what influences that as well. So there are a number of sort of moving targets. It's meant as illustrative, that example, to show sort of a possible scenario for how that would break down.
Thanks, Dan. And yeah, we'll be supplying some information after these webinars, both in a blog format and some simple one-page reference sheets that will help people understand the math. And as Dan said, there is a ton of data that the EPA has put out there on these calculations. And again, it was the EPA is not determining that split of the RIN value between raw biogas producer, the electricity producer, and the OEMs. They really just picked some ratios to figure that out, but that'll all be negotiated bilaterally through those agreements and not determined by the EPA. So Chelsea, we had some questions here, and since you have spent the most time here working on the RFS reports and understanding the supply and demand dynamics in the market, can you talk about two things that we got a lot of questions on? One, how the eRINs will affect the overall supply of the RIN market, and then I guess the other part of that is the dynamics of the monthly versus the quarterly. Will CNG produced RINs still be able to generate monthly data?
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, so I think it's important to point out with the market that the EPA understands that they're adding these eRINs to the market, and so they're anticipating the growth, and they're setting the RVO appropriately from what they expect to come online. Now, if that volume differs from what they expect, that will affect the market, but they do understand that these extra RINs are coming. So I wouldn't necessarily call them like an extra volume because they are accounting for them. And you can see the growth that they're accounting for with the 2024 and the 2025 RVO. So they do expect those. Now, whether or not, like I said, those will come online, or if there's a surplus or the demand isn't quite there, they don't have that added amount, that will affect the market, and we'll just have to kind of play that out and see what all comes to the market within the next 2 years.
Thanks, Chelsea. Yeah, and along the lines of the generation on a monthly or quarterly basis, my understanding is, CNG RINs would still be generated, using their monthly gas statement and RIN generation process. But the quarterly data coming from the renewable electricity and OEM data moves the eRINs essentially to a quarterly generation process, which may not be significant in April of 2024, depending on the number of pathways that get approved. But moving forward, as you look, Chelsea, as you said, in the RVO volumes, significant number, even more RINs would be generated through this renewable electricity process than through the existing CNG pathways. And at that point, it becomes significant that, the overwhelming majority of the D3 RINs are going to get generated quarterly and not monthly. And so there could be some, sort of pricing and liquidity issues during those days where, there's 90 days before a generation cycle and you don't really know what's out there being generated.
Yeah, I think too, Dave, the big thing is, when they were produced monthly, you had 12 months to kind of see where you were at with your obligation and seeing what's out there on the market. Being moved to quarterly is only going to give you really 4 times to understand where the market is and where that's moving. And then a lot of the times the transactions will happen at the end of the year when people are trying to meet their obligation. And with only knowing, really 3 times before that and only having 30 days to finalize that at the end of the quarter, it's going to be different for sure.
So I know we're about 5 minutes over our slotted time, and we'll just want to thank the panel again for all your hard work in preparing these slides. And we're only about 60% through the work for this webinar. So our second step here will be this panel digging into the questions that we didn't get today. And again, we'll be addressing those in a future blog post or seeing some information posted on the website, or reach out to us through email. But we will make sure we get through all the questions. There's a large number of them that came in as well today. But want to thank everybody for attending, and just keep watching the Eco Engineers newsletter and website for our next level of webinars and communication. And stay tuned, as this is going to be an exciting year in both in the regulatory world, as both EPA and CARB look to issue changes to their program. So thanks everyone, and appreciate for coming to that.